Hey everyone, it's Campermcdank here, and welcome to my video on The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time. Now I'm sure what you can gather from the title of the video, not only will we be covering Ocarina of Time, but also the Master Quest release as well. I wanted to cover everything that was released for Ocarina of Time, and yes, on top of both of these titles, we will also be looking at the re-releases of these games that made their way onto the Nintendo 3DS. However, we will only cover the changes which was made for that of the release, but with regards to any footage showcasing those changes, well, I don't have the means to be able to record Nintendo 3DS footage, so unfortunately you'll only get a rundown of the changes that were made. Sorry about that. Now this game means a whole lot to me, as not only was Ocarina of Time one of my earliest gaming experiences, it was one that I've played countless times over the years, and hell, even now to this day. For me, I remember way back when I came home from school and found myself playing this game along with other titles that were released for the Nintendo 64, with those games being Super Mario 64, Mario Kart 64, and even GoldenEye 007. But those are only just some of the titles that I first owned, as since time moved on, I ended up collecting a library of games for my Nintendo 64. Though out of all the games I ended up getting, Ocarina of Time was the one I sunk some serious hours into. The game itself released originally in North America on November 29th, 1998, and it was exclusive for the Nintendo 64, being developed and published by Nintendo. It was honestly my go-to game, and I hope that throughout this video, I can show and tell you guys why this game means as much to me as it does now. I have said this in my other videos, but it goes without saying. If you have not experienced Ocarina of Time or its expansion Master Quest, then I highly advise that you stop this video now and to go play these games and then come back to this video, as we will be going over the game in full. For those who are wanting to stick around for the journey, let's go ahead and talk about one of my all-time favorite games, The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time. So let's go ahead and talk about the story, which starts us off with a narration by a guardian spirit called the Great Deku Tree, who talks about a forest in the land of Hyrule called the Kokiri Forest, which houses beings known as well the Kokiri, individuals who never age and remain the same for all of their life. The Deku Tree mentions how each Kokiri has their own guardian fairy, though there is one boy who doesn't have his own guardian fairy. Let's just say we won't come back around to this until a little later in the game's narrative, but it will come back up again. The boy can go by any name you want when you put it in for your playthrough, but his canonical name is Link, just because it's a way for the player to connect with the individuals in the game, so yeah, I can understand the whole idea there. We see him having a nightmare of sorts where Link appears just after a bridge comes down with two individuals on the run on horseback by another individual who goes by the name Ganondorf, the big bad in the game. Yeah, I know it seems kind of odd to mention who he is here and not later, but let's be honest with ourselves, one look at the guy and you can tell he's bad news and that something is up with him. Either way, the nightmare ends after Ganondorf and Link confront each other. We then cut to a scene with a fairy who goes by the name of Navi, who is being informed by the Deku Tree that evil is afoot and to seek out the boy who does not have a fairy and bring him to the Deku Tree. Navi wakes Link up and then talks about how he is summoned by the Deku Tree and that the two make their way to where he is located. The Deku Tree at this point tells Link that he has been cursed and tasks Link to go inside of him and to rid the curse that plagues him, and Link does that with little to no issue. After this, the Deku Tree congratulates Link on his task and informs Link that an evil man is searching for a place that is known as the Sacred Realm, which contains something that is known as the Triforce. The Deku Tree then kind of talks about everything that exists, and that's thanks to the golden goddesses that are known as Din, Nehru, and Farore. These goddesses are responsible for creating the land of Hyrule, and by doing so, departed for the heavens and left behind golden triangles that showed the point in which they left the world, the resting place that is now called the Sacred Realm. He then tasks Link to head to Hyrule Castle and to meet with the princess there who goes by the name Zelda. He gives Link the Kokiri's emerald and passes away shortly after. After confronting Saria, a childhood friend of Link who knows that Link has to leave the forest, she gives Link an ocarina and he parts ways with her. After making his way into Hyrule Town and getting through the castle grounds by sneaking past some guards, Link makes his way to where Princess Zelda is located. They confront each other, and after Link explains who he is to the princess, she talks about a dream that she had that showed a boy with a ray of light at the forest with the individual holding the spiritual stone, which had resided within the forest with a fairy beside the boy. Basically, it's Link, folks. She tells Link a secret about the Sacred Realm, that being that the goddesses hid the Triforce there, and if someone were to find it and take hold of the Triforce, then they are granted a wish. If, let's say, someone with a righteous heart makes a wish, then it will lead Hyrule to a golden age of prosperity. However, if someone with an evil mind has their wish granted, then the world will be consumed by evil. You don't say. However, to safeguard the Triforce, beings known as ancient sages ended up building a structure called the Temple of Time to make sure evil forces aren't able to make their way to where it is located. A stone wall called the Door of Time protects the Sacred Realm, and in order to open that door, 3 spiritual stones will be needed to be brought together at the door along with a treasure called the Ocarina of Time. At this point, Zelda and Link team up to stop Ganondorf from trying to get his hands on the Triforce, and Zelda tasks Link with getting the other spiritual stones. Link also gets the aid of Impa along the way, and he makes his way to Death Mountain, which houses Gorons, who are rock people who eat rocks. Well, doesn't that just sound like food that just makes your mouth salivate right then and there? Anyways, their chieftain Darunia and his tribe are having quite a bit of an issue where Dodongo's Cavern, a place where the Gorons go to stock up on rocks to eat, has a bit of a monster problem thanks to Ganondorf, and tasks Link with ridding the place of the monsters that lurk within it, and Link accepts the task with no objections, and completes it and obtains the Goron's ruby afterwards. At this point, it leaves just one spiritual stone, and it's located within Zora's domain, which houses the race known as, you guessed it, Zoras. Basically, they're just fish people, that's all. Link confronts King Zora, and the king expresses to Link that his daughter went missing and tasks Link with finding out her whereabouts and to save his daughter. They find this out thanks to a bottle that was left behind in Lake Hylia with a letter detailing where she was last seen. Link obtains a fish and brings it to Lord Jabu Jabu, and the fish along with Link are swallowed by Lord Jabu Jabu. At this point, Link finds Princess Ruto, the daughter of King Zora, and takes out the parasite that lurks within Lord Jabu Jabu and brings Princess Ruto safely, attaining the last spiritual stone needed to open the door of time. On his way back, Link ends up at Hyrule Town's gate but goes through similar events that happened in his dream, although this time we see Princess Zelda throw something to the water nearby Link, with Link confronting the individual chasing after them, that being Ganondorf. Link attempts to hold Ganondorf back, but Ganondorf shows that he isn't messing around. After he deals with Link, he rides off after the princess and Impa, with Link at this point obtaining the object which is called the Ocarina of Time. Yeah, that ocarina that Saria gave you a while back that has sentimental value? Well, screw that, because now we have the Ocarina of Time. Who needs childhood memories? Anyways, after all of this plays out, Link makes his way to the Door of Time and presents the 3 spiritual stones as well as playing a song that was taught to him through a vision Link had after obtaining the ocarina, that being the Song of Time. The door opens and within it holds the Master Sword, a weapon capable of thwarting evil itself. However, after pulling the Master Sword, Link ends up falling into a coma for 7 long years, and because of this event happening, it left the door to the Sacred Realm wide open, and Ganondorf was able to enter the Sacred Realm with little to no resistance. So whoops! We end up in the Chamber of Sages, confronted by one of the ancient sages named Rauru. He tells Link that the Master Sword was the key that sealed the Sacred Realm from the evil forces, which, well, we know how that turned out. We are given a showcase of Link aged up 7 years later with new clothes, which ain't that nice to be provided with this after this whole aging process had occurred. Link, now known as the Hero of Time, is now tasked with gathering the other sages and bringing them back to this chamber. Rauru gives Link the Light Medallion and sends him back to the Temple of Time. But before he sets out, he notices an individual appearing before him from behind who goes by the name of Sheik, a ninja of sorts. He mentions where the temples are located, with those areas being in a deep forest, a high mountain, in a vast lake, within a house that is filled with the undead, and lastly inside a goddess of the sand. He encourages Link to head to where the forest temple is, but before he heads out to the temple, he is also advised that Link should stop by Kakariko Village and obtain an item which will help gain access to the temple itself. And at this point in time, the game follows a pretty consistent formula from here on out, as it goes as such. Link makes his way to the temple, ends up being greeted by Sheik, learns a melody that allows him to come back to the temple if he chooses to, and then Sheik disappears, leaving Link to go into the temple alone and banish whatever evil is held within that temple, and awaken the sage that is found within the temple itself. Link also receives a medallion from the sage that was rescued, and then at this point heads off to the next temple 4 separate times. Now there is some stuff that does occur in between traveling from one temple to the next. For example, when Link is making his way to the Water Temple, he finds out that Zora's domain has been completely frozen over, and after dealing with a mini dungeon, which he acquires an item that allows him to gain access to the Water Temple, he unfreezes the Zora King and makes the promise to save his race from the being that caused this incident. Then there's the incident that occurs when Link makes his way to the Shadow Temple, where he meets up with Sheik, who is trying to take out an evil being that broke out of its seal at the bottom of the well in Kakariko. And Link and Sheik both end up kind of getting messed up by it, with the two coming back into the realm of the living shortly after. Sheik at this point teaches him the melody that will allow him to gain access to the temple where the evil entity went to and banish it. However, you can't really make much progress within the temple unless you find an object that is within the bottom of the well, because without it, you're kind of screwed going into the temple as it's filled with illusions. But yeah, if we're being real, it's the same sort of song and dance routine until Link collects the last medallion. At this point, Rauru contacts Link to return to the Temple of Time to meet with the last sage. When Link returns to the Temple of Time, he is greeted by Sheik, who basically tells Link with how the legend of the Triforce was true when Ganondorf got his hands on it. It ended up splitting into 3 pieces, with Ganondorf obtaining the Triforce of Power, which allowed him to be an evil king. Ganondorf at this point was searching for where the other 2 pieces ended up, with those individuals being chosen by destiny. Sheik unveils to Link that he holds the Triforce of Courage, with the Triforce of Wisdom being held by, big surprise, Zelda, who disguised herself as Sheik to hide her presence from Ganondorf until now for 7 years, I should stress. At this point, Zelda presents Link with a weapon to damage Ganondorf, that being the Light Arrow. arrows. However, soon after this, Ganondorf traps Zelda within a crystal and takes her away to his castle, and at this point, it's up to Link to save Zelda and to stop Ganondorf. Link makes his way to Ganon's castle, which definitely looks menacing as hell, and then is aided by the sages by providing a bridge for Link to be able to enter into Ganon's castle. At this point, Link dispels the barrier within the castle and heads up to where Ganon and Zelda are located and confronts Ganon. At this point, Link and Ganon fight by basically playing good ol' Energy Zeniths with the use of the light arrows and the Master Sword. Link defeats Ganon with Zelda and Link reuniting. However, time is cut short as the castle begins to fall apart and the two make it out of the wake of the castle's destruction. Zelda comments how it's all over, but just shortly after this, noise emits from the rubble in the distance, and when Link checks out the disturbance, it turns out Ganondorf isn't out for the count, and in a desperate act, he utilizes the Triforce of Power to transform into a beast known as Ganon in an awesome sequence, I should stress. At this point, Ganon wields two very menacing blades, with one of his blades clashing against Link, knocking out the Master Sword from his hands, and at this point, Link fights with the tools in his possession. After some fighting has commenced, Ganon is knocked down and Link is able to retrieve the Master Sword, which was knocked behind a firewall that ends up dispelling when Ganon is brought to his knees. The fight commences with Link taking him down to his last stand. Zelda aids in the fight to halt Ganon's movements, giving Link the final blow on Ganon, which is done with the Master Sword going right into his goddamn head. Zelda calls forth the sage's aid in sealing Ganondorf in the Sacred Realm. With Ganondorf's last few words, he curses everyone and mentions that when the seal does break, that he will kill the descendants of Link and Zelda. Zelda and Link are at this point just kinda hanging out, and Zelda tells Link that she will be able to send him back to the past to live out his childhood, which Link allows for, obviously. At this point, the credits roll, showcasing everyone celebrating the defeat of Ganondorf, and shortly after, bringing us to where Link and Zelda first met up in Hyrule Castle, and then the game just ends. And overall, when it comes to talking about Ocarina of Time's story, it's pretty solid. I mean, they took what was established and laid out in the previous game, A Link to the Past, and translated that setup into the 3D landscape. We will get more into it when I cover A Link to the Past, but by and large it's a similar setup to Ocarina of Time. Now the game at one point explains the origins of Hyrule with the goddesses, and I honestly feel like it doesn't really add anything to the game's overall narrative and could have been taken out of the game, as it doesn't really add much but to explain why the world exists. I do, however, like the cast of characters that are presented here, like Princess Ruto, even though she has quite the attachment to Link to the point of wanting to get married with him after he rescues her from Lord Jabu Jabu, and then when they meet up again in the Water Temple when she expresses her frustration at how he kept her waiting for 7 years. Then you have Darunia, which is a personal favorite of mine, as he pretty much just wants his people to be safe and even sacrifices his own life in attempting to stop the evil that plagues them thanks to Ganondorf. A really fun and charismatic character to be around. But yeah, on the whole, it's really just a hero chosen by destiny who goes through and saves the land from evil and stops the big bad at the end of the day. Let's just say you'll see this in pretty much every other installment in the series. And again, it's perfectly fine, as back then they were trying to make sure that those that would be experiencing this shift for the first time going from 2D to 3D would feel comfortable with the transition with regards to the setting and story. My only real sticking points with Ocarina of Time's narrative is that you don't find at any point in time tag teaming with Sheik whatsoever throughout the journey, and I kind of find that puzzling. Like, it would have been cool if one of the temples in the game had you and Sheik tackling it together and succeeding in their efforts, as it would make the big unveiling of Sheik being Zelda later in the game really awesome in hindsight, as this badass character that accompanied you along the way and even helped you on your journey was actually the princess all along. Don't get me wrong, Zelda's still awesome, but I wish they did a bit more with her here. Though when mentioning Sheik, there are actually some lines that get said that stick out to me, and back then, I really didn't give much thought as well as I was a kid when I first played it. But after playing through the game now as an adult, some of the things Sheik says, like how the flow of time is always cruel, as the speed seems different for each person, but no one can change it. It's really deep stuff when you look into this, and it's something that I gave way more thought as time went on. I like these moments, as it adds just a bit more when it comes to talking about Ocarina of Time and the themes that it tackles. Link himself also isn't exactly the most expressive character as well, with a lot of scenes in the game showcasing him with just a rather blank face. Like, I get it's supposed to be the player really going through these events, but not having Link really showcase all that much expression throughout the game doesn't really give the impression that Link has much of a reaction to what's happening to him at all. But yeah, on the whole, the story and characters are great to sit through. And it's something that, well, when it comes to playing it again, I honestly enjoy looking back at some of the outside characters beyond Link. Now, when it comes to talking about the gameplay, there is a reason as to why so many people cite Ocarina of Time as this all-important title, and the reason being is because of the Z targeting system. By pressing the Z button on the N64 controller, Link is able to lock onto enemies and objects in the environment, allowing him to strafe, backflip, and side jump around whatever it is he's targeting. This type of control helps to keep the player engaged with the enemy instead of having to flail their sword around and hoping they don't miss, and it allows for some more invasive maneuvers to dodge incoming attacks. Games before Ocarina of Time really had a hard time doing combat in 3D spaces, as it proved to be a bit more of a challenge. but Nintendo was able to come up with a way to enter combat more effectively, which most 3D action-adventure games still use to this day. Though oddly enough, Link himself can't jump manually in this game, as in order for him to jump, you have to run off ledges in order for him to jump from one platform to the next. It's odd for sure, but understandable, as they didn't want this to turn into something similar to that of Super Mario 64, and while it does take some time to adjust to, it's not too tricky to get down. Though with that said, Link's overall movement is quite slow, and with an open field like Hyrule, it can be kinda long to go from one place to the next. Hyrule Field doesn't really have all that much in the way of various locations to check out, aside from Lon Lon Ranch. I mean, yeah, you get Epona later in the game to make traveling from one area to the next much faster, but until you're going on foot, which ain't remarkable, and I mean, hey, there are hidden caves and such that can be found, but it doesn't help the fact that Hyrule Field is kinda barren with regards to having things to do. Now, Link acquires a number of tools and magic spells on his adventure with items such as the slingshot, boomerang, bombs, bow and arrow, Megaton hammer, and the hookshot. All of the tools that you acquire in the game will be needed in some sense to solve a puzzle of sorts that you come across in the game, whether that be through activating a switch from a distance, or to need to get from one place to the next. Out of all the items that you come across, I love the hookshot, as not only can be used as an offensive weapon, but it also has its uses to help you get from one place to the next. And come on, it's a hookshot. It's pretty sweet, all things considered anyways. The Lens of Truth is also a pretty nifty item, as it allows you to see through illusions, and it's put to good use I find in the Shadow Temple quite well. There are also some collectibles like heart pieces to find, which when you find up to 4, you create another unit of health, and I strongly encourage you to go out of your way to find these, as these help aid you along the way, and that way you won't find yourself near death's door all too often, if you're thorough enough in your exploration. The big collectible would have to easily be the Golden Skulltula tokens, as there are 100 of these scattered across Hyrule, as well as being in dungeons and temples. Now you are rewarded in increments, as they can range from expansions to your wallet, allowing you to carry more rupees, to even getting a heart piece. Though if you were to ask me, just collect up to 50, as if you're going for all heart pieces, getting 50 will earn you a heart piece, and that's what you really are going for at the end of the day. The ultimate reward for collecting all 100 in my opinion is not worth it, as it's just an infinite amount of rupees, which if I'm honest, you don't spend all that much of anything in the game. The side quests in the game are a neat distraction, with one of the side quests in the game, that being helping the Happy Mask Salesman, is a decent enough side quest. While it's kinda confusing at points when trying to find out who to give what mask to, the ultimate reward for it is a mask that helps aid you when trying to collect everything in the game, which is to basically wear the mask and walk up to Sheikah Stones and interacting with them. The item trading quest is also a serious staple, as when everything is all said and done, the reward for completing it is the big Goron sword, which is an awesome sword allowing for some serious damage, and was honestly my go-to sword throughout the entire game. Yeah, sure, you can't probably guard with it, but who cares? You destroy everything in this game in one hit, except for bosses. They still require a few hits though not that many. Won't lie though, the spells that you acquire, while they are nice, I didn't personally find myself using all that much. You've got Din's Fire, which is an AoE fire spell that hits everything around you with fire damage, and this is a spell to solve puzzles with it at points, which basically means it's required. Then you have Ferora's Wind, which can be used to make backtracking in dungeons less painless. Didn't personally use this too much, but I can tell it definitely has its uses for those that might find themselves needing to backtrack often in case they missed a key or something. Nehru's Love is alright when you use it. It creates a barrier around you which prevents all damage and lasts for 1 minute. Though the point in which you get it in the game is so late, I didn't even bother using it, but hey, I'm sure some folks out there have gotten some good mileage on it. Though when active, you can't use any other spells or anything that consumes magic, so that kinda sucks. You can also acquire 3 different elemental arrows, that being fire arrows, ice arrows, and light arrows. Of course, like with the spells in the game, these elemental arrows drain magic, so I hope you got some magic on standby if you want to use these babies often. The fire and light arrows are required for progression, but the ice arrows are optional, so that's kinda neat. Though like with Nehru's Love, it comes pretty late in the game, so unless you know when you can get them at the earliest possible time, you might not come across them until near the very end of the game, which by then you might only be able to use them a few times, but that's about it. You are able to assign up to 3 items for each respective C button on the controller, which allows you to be able to pull out an item in need at any one given time, and this is really neat. It means less going into your inventory for an item and more you playing the game. Now when talking about the dungeons and temples that you travel through, they are pretty much places that you put the most into combat as well as testing your brains by having you solve puzzles within them. The first 3 dungeons in the game really aren't all that tricky and can be beaten pretty easily. Those dungeons being the Great Deku Tree, Dodongo's Cavern, and inside Jabu Jabu's Belly. I do think out of all of them, inside Jabu Jabu's Belly is pretty unique as well, since you're not traveling through any sort of structure and instead are inside a living being, which is pretty gross, not gonna lie, but memorable all the same. Also, I wouldn't think too much about the layout of the inside of the fish, as trust me, you'll just wonder how everything all works, and your brain will hurt as a result. Overall, not too bad, but the idea here is to get players accustomed with what to expect going into a dungeon. Things don't really pick up in terms of difficulty until you become an adult and make your way inside the Forest Temple, which bumps up the difficulty accordingly. For me, I honestly actually really like the Forest Temple, simply for the music and atmosphere, as it really showcases the transition, turning into an adult and facing some harder challenges and much more fearful enemy types. So fun fact, when I first played through Ocarina of Time way back when, I could not get through the Forest Temple, not because of the difficulty of the temple itself, but because of the fact that I was too terrified to go through the temple, and it's because of one enemy. That enemy being the Wall Master. No joke, I actually gave my controller to my brother who progressed through the temple for me because I was too terrified when dealing with the Wall Masters my first go around. I mean, I still think they are one of the most disturbing enemies in the game, with it just being a hand that comes from the ceiling that drags you upwards towards it. It also has a bone sticking out from it, which is just gross. There are also other spookier enemies like the Redeads, which really got to me for a while, but was able to bravely face them later down the road. You also get the fairy bow here, which is a nice weapon to use for some solid damage, and is put to good use in the temple on the whole when finding the solutions to the puzzles here. The fire temple is honestly not all that bad of a dungeon, all things considered, and I personally enjoyed it. You get the Megaton hammer here, which unfortunately doesn't see much use outside of the temple, which is kinda sad, but that's just how it be. And oh, the water temple. Okay, so I know this temple gets a lot of flack, and trust me, I don't really enjoy this temple all that much. Though it isn't because of the puzzles themselves, no, that isn't my issue with the temple. The issue comes from the fact that you have to pause your game at multiple points in the temple in order for you to equip the iron boots, so that way you can navigate your way through the dungeon itself. I should note that this kind of problem was fixed in the 3DS version, which I will get to later, but for now we are sticking with the N64 version of the game, and oh boy, it's not all that much fun to go through. I also didn't even like the mini-boss that you come across, that being Dark Link. For me, what I believe the developers wanted this fight to be was a one-on-one sword fight between you and basically yourself, but the way in which Dark Link is programmed is that he basically deflects all of your attacks with his own sword and can get free hits on you easily. He can also jump on top of your sword if you thrust at him, allowing him to get a cheap hit on you, the coward. This fight really just turns into how you can cheese the hell out of him in order for you to win. Now, while you can take him on with an actual sword fight and potentially win, I wouldn't recommend it simply because you'll lose way more health than needed, or even die as a result. You want my advice on him? You can use Din's Fire until you run out of magic, and at that point you can use the Megaton Hammer. Or if you want, you could try throwing a Deku Nut at him at a 45-degree angle and stunning him, allowing you to get an attack in. I should also note that this trick in particular I learned literally a few days ago, and was surprised that it even worked when I tried it out. I didn't record me doing it, unfortunately, but look it up. It's really helpful if you find yourself struggling with this fight. But yeah, aside from all of that, the water temple is fine, but the way in which the iron boots work in the game, with you having to stop the action time and time again, makes the temple way more tedious than it needs to be with the constant menuing. The Shadow Temple is next, and I honestly think it's another great temple, though like with the Forest Temple, this is one I got spooked trying to play through when I was younger at the time. Honestly, the puzzles are fun to solve, and the boss itself is pretty unique. As with most Zelda bosses that require to use the item found within the dungeon to beat them, this boss doesn't. And honestly, I wish they designed more bosses like this one, as I think it could lead to more interesting fights, rather than it being using the item found within the dungeon to take out the boss and win. But yeah, the Shadow Temple has some solid puzzles, and it doesn't feel in any way a drag like the Water Temple. The temple makes great use of the Lens of Truth and the hover boots that you get within the temple itself, and they aren't used to hell and back, which makes the temple very bearable. The Spirit Temple is my favorite temple in the entire game. The first portion of the temple requires that you play through as young Link and help aid an individual by the name of Naboro, who is a lone wolf from the Gerudo looking to take the dungeon's treasure, which are the Silver Gauntlets, which is to help stop Ganondorf. After going through part of the temple and obtaining them, she is then captured by the bosses of the temple and is taken deeper within the temple itself. It's at this point where you travel forward into time and finish the temple as adult Link, and honestly, it's utilizing the time travel mechanic in the game in an interesting way. You also get the mirror shield, as I really think aesthetically it looks really cool, and the temple makes good use of the shield in terms of puzzle solving. It makes you wish that they utilized the time traveling mechanic in more interesting ways, but I'm happy they found a way to incorporate it here in this temple. Again, the puzzles in here are satisfying, and the pace throughout the temple doesn't drag downward in any real way. The music also is really great to listen to, which we'll talk about the music later on in the video. That just leaves us with Ganon's Castle, which yes, I am considering this place a dungeon, as it has you doing a number of puzzles and such. Overall, it's not a bad final area, and it sets the tone and mood pretty much the entire time you're there to when you make your way to confront Ganon. Now, the bosses throughout the game are pretty simple to take down, as like what I said earlier, it's about using the item you found within the dungeon and taking them out in a rather quick fashion. The first phase of the Ganon fight basically has you doing the same kind of thing with what you did in the Forest Temple's boss fight, which is basically playing energy tennis. But once you fight him head on in his beast-like form, it's easily one of the best final fights in any video game to me, honestly. His damage output is very much a real deal, and the setting and atmosphere of the fight is matched wonderfully, making him appear as this menacing force that you're putting your all into taking down. The first few moments in the fight where he knocks your sword away from you immediately puts you into a tense situation where you're fighting with what you got, and when you finally obtain your sword again, it's one hell of a duel. It's fantastic, pure and simple. When looking at the game's visuals today, they are certainly outdated with a lot of 2D imagery like pre-rendered backgrounds and such, which were mainly used to probably help with the game's overall performance and limited space, since Nintendo opted to stick to using cartridges over the new CD disc ROMs that were making the scenes thanks to the Sony PlayStation. Dated visuals aside, there are some areas with really creative visuals like the Ice Cavern, especially the room where you obtain the Iron Boots, as to me, it just captures a simplistic but oddly beautiful area thanks to the minimal detail scattered throughout the walls of the room. It obviously looked really solid at the time, but like with most early 3D games that aren't going for any sort of style and just aim for realism, they end up looking much dated faster as a result. Also, as it looks probably clear to you all, the resolution is also fairly low to look at these days on modern displays, and I would recommend to play these games on a CRTV in some capacity, or find some way to mod your console to allow for HDMI output. The music for the game is wonderfully composed, which is done by the very talented Koji Kondo. His work in a majority of the Zelda titles as well as in the Mario series is truly legendary stuff, and for me personally, I listen to a lot of what he has composed over the years, whether it be in the background or when I'm working on videos, or even when I'm simply just lounging around and just want something to play in the background. There are some great songs on Ocarina of Time as well, and I'm obviously going to play a few tracks for you guys that for me, I still listen to on a day-to-day basis. The soundtrack has a lot of great stuff to listen to, but also quite a number of ambient pieces that, while aren't something I listen to often, I still think they do an excellent job of conveying the town, dungeon, or area that you find yourself in. It can be unsettling at times, while also making you feel like you truly are on an epic quest. Koji Kondo, to me, is easily one of the best composers out there, and the music in which he has created is still some of the most recognized pieces in the entire landscape of video game music. Yeah, I'm a fan of his work, plain and simple. There have also been a ton, and I do mean a ton of remixes out there on the tracks within Ocarina of Time and other Zelda games as well, but I would highly encourage you all to listen to them because there are really some talented musicians out there that basically took what was pretty much fantastic and gave them an entirely new spin, really making something great out of those original tracks. Now, as you probably already read in the title, I also want to talk about an expansion of sorts that was released later on the Nintendo GameCube on February 17th, 2003, which on top of there being a re-release of Ocarina of Time, there was also an expansion called Master Quest. Master Quest is basically Ocarina of Time, but with harder and trickier dungeons. Now, for Master Quest, I only felt compelled to only record that of the dungeons, because by and large, everything outside of the dungeons is one-to-one the same. Like straight up, towns, caves, and other areas of the game are identical, and I already recorded much of that for Ocarina of Time, and honestly, it would really be redundant to record those areas as it would fill up more space on my storage device. With that being said, what are my thoughts on the remixed dungeons, so to speak? For the most part, I'd say these aren't all that bad, and in most cases, changes the way in which you would normally progress through a dungeon from the original game. Take for example the Fire Temple. In Ocarina of Time, the entrance contains 2 doors on the lower level that you wouldn't even touch until near the end of the dungeon. Now in Master Quest, you go through those doorways and then sort of go through the rest of the dungeon as normal, for the most part. The one thing I noticed often was how much more use of the Song of Time got when playing through Master Quest, for the better and worst. Let's just say if you're the completionist type, then this is going to be a big nuisance, as in some cases when it comes to the Skulltula collecting, time blocks can be littered in areas where it blocks the path from you to where the golden Skulltula tokens are. Also, I hope you like dealing with the Stalfos enemies, as they are littered in almost every adult dungeon in the game, sometimes encountering up to 3 at a time. Now, as I said earlier, the dungeons and temples are for the most part pretty satisfying to go through again in Master Quest, but there were definitely a few moments where I swear they put solutions to some puzzles in really aggravating places. Let's take the Forest Temple for example. There is a well that is filled with water, and naturally, you need to find a switch of some sort in order to lower the water level, so that way you can make your way down and collect the small key down there needed for progression. So for literally 15 to 20 minutes roughly, I was looking up and down and all around for wherever this switch was, and for the life of me, I couldn't find it. I wasn't able to find it until I looked up a guide and it showed me that the switch was located on the inside of the well. I was actually annoyed by this because of the fact that the last place I would ever check for a solution to this would be directly where it was at the point of entry. I know you could say that I didn't check my surroundings carefully enough, but I don't care. I thought this was really dumb. And for me, the temple I found myself backtracking quite a lot in was, hilariously enough, not the water temple, but the shadow temple. And that is simply because there are chests that are invisible that house keys in them, and the amount of times I needed to use Ferrar's Wind and backtrack my way to basically the beginning of the temple in order to find these keys was getting to be quite the nuisance. Probably would have helped if I found the map and compass as soon as possible, but I guess I didn't think to check certain parts of the dungeon, which ended up housing these items. But man, was it annoying to having to find myself at a locked door in this temple. But yeah, on the whole, the changes made to the dungeons are for the most part pretty positive for me at the very least, but not without some small annoyances every once in a while. Now I know this video has gone on for quite a while, but I do want to address the 3DS version of Ocarina of Time. By and large, it's the same game, but with an updated presentation and a much smoother frame rate, bringing the FPS from the original N64 release, which targeted 20 FPS, and bringing it up to 30 FPS. The animations are also much smoother, as well as giving us much more fluent movements and attacks. And in terms of gameplay changes or quality of life improvements, you can now have up to 4 item slots instead of 3, and the Ocarina has its own item slot, which is pretty awesome. Thanks to the 3DS version, you also have the ability to use gyro aiming controls, which makes lining up shots in some of the minigames much more manageable and just providing a much better sense of control in first person mode. You can still use standard aiming controls if you like, but I vastly prefer the gyro controls over the traditional control scheme when it comes to aiming at anything. There's also a boss rush mode that was added, and the way in which to access it is by going into Link's room and interacting with his bed to initiate it. It's not much, but if you find yourself wanting to refight a particular boss again, then hey, it's there. There's also a Sheikah stone that you can crawl into to provide you hints on where to go next on your adventure if you ever find yourself stuck at any point in the game. This is completely optional and in no way do you need to interact with it to progress the game forward in any way, which I'm perfectly fine with. Oh yeah, while it may not seem like a big one, it's one that to me matters a lot, and that would be that the text speed got a boosted speed, which just makes the game go by much faster than the snail's pace of the original. Another big one would be how the hover boots and iron boots can now be assigned to any item slot instead of having to pause the game and go into the menu to equip them manually, which, thank God, it makes going through the water temple much less tedious and overall makes it a much better dungeon as a result. Still not one of my favorites, but much more tolerable, that's for sure. As for Master Quest, as yes, this was also included for the 3DS version, the changes here would be that the world is flipped, which I don't get how flipping the world makes it hard, but hey, whatevs I guess. Then you got the fact that you can also take double the damage, meaning Stalfos and Iron Knuckles just became a whole lot scarier to fight as a result. The double damage is the hard hitter if you're someone like me who finds themselves blazing through a lot of areas, and the next thing you know, the potshots that enemies get on you drop you down to next to nothing with regards to your health. If you were to ask me about which version to play between the two, just play the 3DS version, as I feel that was done really well on the whole, as it not only retained the original art style of Ocarina of Time very well, but also made it far more enjoyable thanks to the quality of life improvements to some major aspects of the game. So yeah, that everyone is The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time and Master Quest. To this day, Ocarina of Time is still talked about by many, and for a very good reason. It still, to this day, holds up very well. The game itself is still super fun to play, even today, 22 years later on. Good lord, that is a long time. The re-release of the game on the 3DS for me is the absolute go-to version if you ever find yourself wanting to experience Ocarina of Time for yourself. While the N64 version has its charm in certain places, it's hard to really sit down and look at it for an extensive period of time today, especially if all you have are full HD TVs or 4K TVs. The game for me is one of my all-time favorites, and to this day still holds its place up there with a lot of gusto when it comes to my go-to games to play to this very day. A part of that may be bias, but what can you expect from someone who grew up with this game and has played it for so many years? It's still an easy recommendation no matter what version you play, but if you're going to get your hands on it, get the 3DS version and you're pretty much going to be all set. Alright everyone, that's going to be it for me. If you enjoyed this video, then please be sure to leave a like, and hey, maybe subscribe if you enjoy the type of content that I create here. I hope you guys and gals enjoyed the video, and I will see you all next time. Have a safe morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone.